Welcome to Core and Bath Conversations, a podcast series dedicated to adoption, fostering and kinship care. We ask children's social care professionals and experts by experience to join us to share with us and you, our listeners, their experiences, reflections and knowledge. I hope you enjoy.
Okay, welcome to another episode of the Adoption and Fostering Journal podcast. You can find all previous episodes of our podcast and the journal articles we are discussing via the Core & Bath resource webpage under coreandbath.org.uk/resources. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's guest, Dr. Saul Hillman. Saul is a senior research fellow and research tutor at the Anna Freud Centre and an honorary lecturer at University College London. And today we will be talking about one of his research projects from which he and his team published multiple articles in adoption and fostering. Saul, hello and welcome. How are you?
Thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity to speak. So my time at Anna Freud, which has spanned over 2 decades, it's been in parallel to this longitudinal adoption research project that started in the late 1990s, and I've been involved in all 3 phases, which has involved conducting assessments with children, being very involved in the analysis, and later on writing my PhD, which specifically looked at one of the measures I'm going to be talking about today, the story stems. So my main interest has been in attachment and has involved, as I said, working on the story stems. And I'm going to talk today about 3 papers which we have either published or about to be published, 2 of which are more quantitative and focus around attachment, and another one which is more on the qualitative side, looking at more experiential factors.
And just for our listeners, the articles we're discussing today, they're all from the same research project, right? So tell us all about it. So what is it? What is it called, and what is it about?
Absolutely. So the original study, which, as I say, began in the late 90s, it was named Adoption and Attachment Study, and it was a collaboration between Coram, Anna Freud, and the Institute of Child Health, Great Ormond Street. And the 3 original principal investigators were Dr. Miriam Steele, Dr. Jill Hodges and Jean Cagnac. And it started off as a project which wasn't necessarily thinking about the longitudinal nature. It was simply looking at late and early placed adopted individuals and their families. So in sum, we saw 111 children in the first phase, roughly split between those who were late adopted. So they were placed with their families between the ages of 4 and 8 years. And they'd experienced a lot of maltreatment, a lot of discontinuity. And then our comparison group was an early adopted infancy group who were seen at the same age, but who'd been adopted in infancy, mostly within the first 6 months, and there'd been no recorded known adversity. So with our late adopted group, which was a group of most interest, we knew that there'd been a huge number of caregiver changes, up to 18 in some of the children, multiple maltreatments and birth family risk factors. So even though attachment was at the heart of it, which included carrying out adult attachment interviews with both adoptive mothers and adoptive fathers prior to the children being placed, we also explored many other different domains: psychopathology, parent mental health, stress, self-confidence, affect regulation, and both adoptive parents were interviewed at baseline in terms of their own parenting capacity, their own perceptions as well. So that first phase, we saw the families at baseline, 12 months later and 24 months later. So a huge amount of data, interview data, observational data, and questionnaire data. We then, in early adolescence, we saw them again at one time point. There was natural attrition, but we saw around 70 to 75 children across the 2 samples. and we interviewed them this time. They were too old to have story stems, so they were interviewed on the friends and family interview, which was a interview schedule that Miriam and Howard Steele had formulated. Lots of questionnaires, and we also interviewed the adoptive parents as well. And then just to fast forward to the present day, we have had a third phase. Unfortunately, it was unfunded, but it did allow us with lots of postgraduate students and researchers to interview a lot of young adopted adults who we'd seen at the previous phases and their adoptive parents. The numbers I say were down, but the richness of the information that they told us was huge. So that's just a brief summary of the phases.
I just reflected when you were saying it, because I wanted to ask you generally about what's innovative about it, but then I thought, just reflecting on that, it was kind of established in the mid-90s, and a study like that in the mid-90s was quite a novel and quite groundbreaking thing, right? Looking at kind of late placement at that time, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It was definitely novel in that we had this late adopted group, an early adopted group. We worked across a number of different adoption agencies and even local authorities. So it was quite a mixed sample where we saw families up and down the country. In terms of its uniqueness, its novelty, we used a very large battery of measures, quantitative and qualitative measures, and across a number of domains beyond attachment. I think another strength I feel of the studies, we did manage to interview and have questionnaire data from nearly all of the adoptive fathers, because quite often the fathers end up being neglected in these sorts of research studies. So yeah, it was novel also because I guess we were using relatively new instruments. The story stems back in the late 90s was quite new. Now we run trainings in it internationally. Miriam and Howard's interview on the Friends and Family interview again was a relatively new instrument. And we collaborated. We were collaborating between a range of different institutions, which has again added, I think, a lot to the study.
It was a large sample as well, wasn't it? What's the original sample size, like at baseline?
Baseline, we had 111 children across the two samples. Yes, and it did dip to phase 2, and it's been hard to follow up families in phase 3, but we've nevertheless managed to gather quite a lot of data.
Because I think 70 out of 111, that's still pretty good to follow up.
Yes.
And what are the type of questions that kind of you were asking for the wider research project that can help us answer?
Yes, I mean, I think it relates actually to two of the papers I'm going to talk about today. And, given the fact that attachment was very much at the heart of this study, and it was very much the area that Miriam Steele and Jill Hodges were very focused on as well, both academically and clinically. So I think we were very interested in looking at attachment and internal working models, and with the longitudinal nature of the study, both at phase 1, where we saw the children yearly at 3 time points, and then when we saw them again in adolescence and used another attachment measure, that was probably the principal question we were interested in, which was looking to see, well, what happens to these children, particularly in the late place group, where they had often spent the first 7-8 years of their life in multiple environments where there was a lot of adversity, there was a lot of discontinuity. So we wanted to see, well, what happens when they are in a stable home, and pretty much every single one of these adoptive placements remained stable, which was actually quite remarkable. I'm only aware of any one placement out of the late place sample which broke down. So we had a placement that was consistent and stable. And we were really interested through the story stems and then later with the friends and family interview to see what happens over that period of time in terms of their attachment. And I'll talk a little bit later about, two of those papers that address that question.
And just because you mentioned internal working models, I think all listeners will be familiar with attachment, but I'm not. But maybe just to be sure, can you just briefly say what is an internal working model?
Of course, no. So internal working models very much stem from the work of John Bowlby, and if we think about internal working models, they are like our expectations based on our experiences. So Bowlby talked about how new experiences are very slowly assimilated into existing models. They're like scripts. So if we think about one of these late-placed children who had been placed at the age of 6 years old, they'd had previous experiences or internal working models of parents often as being very unresponsive, unavailable, maybe rejecting, a lot of discontinuity. So it was their expectation of how do we expect others to be around us? How do we expect we're able to operate around us? Do we avoid situations or do we manage through resilience to navigate our way through them? So the theory of internal working models, which is at the heart of what we're interested in, is that if those children who have been in adverse situations are then in more loving, stable environments where parents are available, where parents can be supportive and affectionate, that actually through the assessments we use, and a story stems is an assessment that's semi-projective, so it's not an interview as such, that actually those children maybe will start to see adults as being okay and either reducing the negativity in how they might perceive them, but also seeing them as being potentially more helpful and present.
Shall we talk maybe about the study?
Yeah.
So what shall we start with? With which one would you like to start?
Thank you. No, I think chronologically in all ways, because it was the first paper I think we published with adoption and fostering back in 2020. It's also chronological in that it just refers to the first phase of the study. So it relates to the story stems, and the story stems, just for those who are not familiar with the tool, it's a narrative-based tool where the interviewer introduces the child to 13 standardized stems. They're all different conflicts, and the child, both through narration and through enacting, through Playmobil figures and animals and props, they respond to these narratives. And it's a measure that is a displaced measure in that it's not about themselves. So we very clearly tell the child at the beginning of the task, this is a story about another family, and we get the child to name the dolls, and all the research and the evidence suggests that children will be far less inhibited if they're talking about another family. Mm-hmm. Yet at the same time, we are also learning a lot about their perceptions and experiences. So the story stems is a very rich tool. We videoed these children in both the late and early adopted group. We did it at baseline, 1 year later and 2 years later. They then get filtered through a very intensive coding system, all these stories, and 39 different codes. And the constructs are very attachment orientated. So we can learn about security, disorganization, and it's a dimensional measure. So it's not a classification one like the AAI and the strange situation. Just to sort of summarize what came out of this study was there were two parts to the paper. The first paper simply looked at baseline, and it looked to see what were the children internal representation through the story stems in the late place group, the early adopted group, and we even had a community group who had no known adversity and had been raised with their birth parents. And what we saw was that the children in the late place group had statistically significantly more avoidance, disorganization, and insecurity, and significantly less security. Interestingly, The community sample had the direct opposite.
Mm.
And the early adopted group, who we don't believe had experienced any maltreatment from social worker records and no known discontinuity. Nevertheless, they had been placed at around, between 0 and 8 months. And that sample lay somewhere between the late place group and the community group, closer to the community group, which is what we would expect. So it was that first sub-study within that paper really did clearly sort of show the differences that we would expect to see.
That's quite interesting that the kind of early adopted group also showed differences to the kind of not adopted group who grew up with the biological.
Absolutely. And as I said, retrospectively, the social workers at the time of the study, their records didn't suggest there had been any discontinuity or maltreatment. However, obviously, it's not absolutely foolproof. So it is possible that,
I mean, do you know the reasons? Is it relinquished children then mainly who were in that group at the time?
Absolutely. And so, they tended to move straight from their birth families into an adoption, and there weren't any additional steps along the way. So our research findings, suggested that maybe nevertheless there was still some impact that placement may have had. But there's a little bit of cautiousness that I like to exert because we don't know enough about those families and the histories. We weren't able to extract as much information.
Yeah.
But the second part of the paper, the second sub-study, I think in some ways is more interesting because that's when we looked at the story stems at time point 1, 2, and 3 in both the late and the early place group. And what we were able to show there was very much in tandem with what John Bowlby would have said about internal working models, that actually things can take a long time. Things won't assimilate very quickly. And some things improve, but other things will not improve in 1 or even 2 years, given the fact that that child may have had up to 7 years of highly challenging circumstances. So in terms of not the raw stats, but the salient findings, we found that security significantly increased from year 1 to year 2 to year 3. And we found that avoidance, all those defensive avoidance maneuvers, significantly decreased. However, we found that the disorganization and the insecure responses, so that some of the negative representations of adults and children, they did decrease, but not as significantly. And at first, we looked at the findings and we were a little bit surprised, but it made complete sense within the sort of construct.
Was that the same for the late placed and the early placed group, or were there differences?
So yes, so for the late place group showed that the most. The early place group, there weren't changes in that respect. I think at time point 3, the differences between the late and the early place group evened out a little bit more. The late adopted children were becoming more secure, less avoidant, whereas there was less change with the early adopted group. There was some change. They were becoming a little bit more secure and less avoidant, but it was not to the same extent.
Did they reach the level of the community group ever, the early?
They didn't reach the level of the community group. We only collected data on a community sample at one time point, so we were never.
Okay.
We never actually followed them up. But it just in terms of those scores that the community sample scored on, no, even 2 years into placement, the late adopted group were telling stories completely differently. I mean, the themes, it was quite moving reading a story from one child, seeing how they were able to bring in affectionate responses, or they were able to show a child seeking help, whereas not on the same story a year previously, it was chaotic. It was full of a lot of negativity.
So much more drastic changes in the late adopted group.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So yeah, it was a really sort of interesting study. Interestingly, and I know we're not the only study to experience this. When we did look at some of the pre-placement factors like number of maltreatment subtypes or the number of changes that a young person had, that didn't end up contributing towards, didn't end up impacting the changes.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we'd assumed that children who'd had more extreme experiences pre-placement would have the worst profile of attachment representations.
But that wasn't the case.
That wasn't the case, absolutely, and we were reflected a bit on that. We wondered whether there was a ceiling effect to a certain degree, that these children, whether these children had experienced 2 maltreatment types or 5 maltreatment types. It was significant. It already reached a significant threshold.
They all had quite a few placement changes and quite a significant amount of maltreatment that they experienced, right? So
yeah.
So maybe they were all kind of above the level that had an impact.
Yes, so that was the first paper which we were delighted to have published in your journal.
And the title is, so that our listeners can look it up.
Yeah. So the title is Assessing Changes in the Internal Worlds of Early and Late Adopted Children Using the SSAP.
And we will also do our best to link those papers with the podcast.
Sign up to receive our regular newsletters and keep up to date with the latest news, publications, training, events and job vacancies. Visit corambath.org.uk/stay informed for more info.
Where did you go from there? So what happened next?
So where do we go from there is, and this is partly thanks to some funding from the Sir Halley Stewart Foundation, we realised that we hadn't sufficiently analysed a lot of the adolescent data. So we got a grant, I got a researcher, and we started working our way through some of those papers. And the first one I wanted to look at was looking at attachment from the story stems up to adolescents, where we used the friends and family interview. And I believe that's a paper that's coming out in a couple of months in your journal. Is that right?
Yes, it's already accepted,
okay.
Not yet printed.
Okay.
Well.
So it's titled The Predictors of Attachment in Early and Late Late Placed Adoptees. It's looking at, as I say, a further step in the sort of attachment trajectory in both the late and the early placed samples. And again, this was very interesting. It was quite complex because we were using different measures. Our sample size had dropped, but we still had a sufficient sample in order to do quantitative analysis. So in sum, what we were able to show was there was significance in the models, which were basically looking to see whether the story stem attachment representations were predictive of their attachment representations in adolescents. And the friends and family interview had a similar set of constructs. They were ordinal, which we were able to link them to. So I think the first thing to say is that the 3 of these models, security, disorganization and coherence, which were subscales on the FFI, they were significant in relation to the story stems, but the biggest driver was IQ. So, that was one finding that we wanted to reflect upon. And interestingly, the sample that the child was placed in, early and late placed, wasn't, again, a predictive factor of this change. So we did have a delve a little bit deeper to see if there were any other findings as such. And we were able to show that.
Maybe just for our listeners, because some might be less well versed in stats maybe. So can you just say again, so the models were significant and there were 2 factors, right? So one was is it that the story stem representations earlier in development predicted the interview attachment representations in adolescence?
Absolutely. And we were adding in other variables. So with the late place group, the number of placement changes, a number of maltreatment subtypes. So we wanted to see whether you could predict if a young person in adolescence was disorganized on a friends and family interview based on how they presented on the story stems in the first phase.
So that doesn't mean there was continuity, basically, so that if you were kind of disorganized early on, it was more likely that you were disorganized kind of later on in development.
Absolutely. And, as I say, we had some findings that did show that trajectory. So the more insecurity on story stems at time point 1 was predictive of higher levels of disorganization on a friends and family interview at adolescence. Other interesting findings that came out of the study, I won't have time to sort of talk about them all, but we found that high levels of security on the FFI were predictive of less defensive avoidance on the story stems, and also children who had been in less than 5 placements. So just to translate that, meaning the more placements you've been in, the lower the IQ, and the more avoidance on the story stems would lead to lower levels of security.
Okay, so IQ also played a role, basically.
IQ played a role throughout the study. And interestingly, it partly relates to the previous paper, the story stem construct, which was of most interest in this paper, was the one around avoidance. And that was the strongest contributor. So a child who showed the strongest levels of different defensive avoidance maneuvers seemed to be the construct that was most likely to explain changes in attachment on the FFI in adolescents.
Changes as in, so positive changes as in catch up, or no, not catch up the wrong word, but in moving towards a more secure attachment representation?
Changes in terms of more secure. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Was that surprising? Was that something you expected?
I guess, yeah. Some of these findings were surprising. I think we had expected there to be maybe more of a clear trajectory from phase 1 to phase 2. And, given the amount of time that had existed between the previous story stem assessment and the friends and family interview, the number of other factors and variables that were playing out in their lives, we know that with attachment studies or with any longitudinal studies, there's so many other variables that are going to be playing their part.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The study as a whole was interesting, but it didn't maybe show as clean a picture of trajectories we saw in the first paper. But there were some interesting findings. In the second part of the paper, I should say, we just focused on the late place group and again were able to show models that were significant in explaining the variation. So again, defensive avoidance, the more defensive avoidance and more abuse was the strongest predictor of how the levels of security that they had in adolescence. And I think defensive avoidance is going to influence later development. And, these children had developed lots of strategies to keep those painful feelings at bay.
Can you give an example of defensive avoidance? So how does it look like in a child?
So in the story stems, a defensive avoidance can be a shutting down. So, for example, a child might close off a story after something awful's happened. So a child burns their hand and there's a terrible fire, and then that's the end of the story. So there are many other ways where the child just avoids the conflict. So we've got a code that might just be as simple as, a story about a child burning their hand. There's no mention of the hand being burned. They talk about the food spilling on the floor, but there's no mention of the central construct. So there are different ways in which children might circumnavigate the story.
We have one study left, don't we?
One study left, which is a nice different study, and it's a study that I think was published either earlier this year or the end of last year.
Adoptive parents' worries and concerns about their adolescent adopted children.
So this just looked at late adopted children. So it focused on the interviews that we carried out with the parents of late adopted children. And we interviewed 17 adoptive parents and interviewed on the parent development interview, Arietta Slade's measure. And it's a very rich, varied interview. There are a number of questions which tap into the sorts of anxieties and fears that these parents of 12 to 15-year-olds might have. So we did a thematic analysis of these interviews, and some, really strong, heightened themes came out of the study. So just to sort of give you a flavour of the themes, we had one theme which we named vulnerability, and it really captured parents' concerns about their child's susceptibility to risk or disadvantage across contexts. So they worried about their child being too impressionable. They worried about their child being unsafe, making poor decisions in relation to social interactions, relationships. And a lot of our children or adolescents in a sample had additional needs. So it felt like a sort of a heightened sense of concern about things in relation to them. We had another theme around violence, where again, this was either violence that they'd already experienced, observed, but violence they really feared that they were going to see in a young person. And that violence was subdivided into both risk to self and risk to others. So again, both of those strands came out, probably more about that young person's risk to hurting others than about being hurt themselves.
Are those in the sense of peers or also child on parent?
It was more about peer interactions. I think a lot of the themes, if you look at the thread that runs through them, it was about the worlds that they were entering. And, bearing in mind, a lot of these young people were, right at the cusp of adolescence, 12, 13, but they were already presenting really quite significant concerns in terms of their behaviour. There was another theme around derailing opportunities, sabotaging, and some really catastrophic fears that parents expressed about their child's existence. And there were others around autonomy. I found the fourth theme, autonomy, really interesting because it really captured both the young person's readiness for autonomy, but the parents, the adoptive parents who, had been through, a huge journey over the previous period of time since that child had arrived. And they were often acknowledging that their own emerging loss of agency and was a real struggle, particularly given the fact that their young person was very challenging and they felt more disempowered and were having to navigate that. And just briefly, just the final theme, because I think this is really interesting. We've not talked very much about the birth family. And the final theme was really about anxieties around the presence and the role of the birth family. And that did exist with a lot of these adoptive parents. Now, this is interesting in the fact that the birth family had a minimal role in the child's life. They may have had minimal communication or none whatsoever. So we're talking letterbox communication. Yet, as the child embarks upon adolescence, there was a huge fear in the child's interest in possibly meeting their birth parents, the fear of repetition. So some of the behaviours that they were conscious of in relation to the birth families, they were sort of frightened of that. So that was a theme that, again, it wasn't necessarily shared by every single participant, but it wasn't isolated either.
So a lot of worries.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of worries. And, and of course, you may ask, and a lot of people may say, well, adolescence is a very turbulent period. And, it's a moratorium where it can be very chaotic. But this felt very, very heightened. Some of the descriptions showed huge fears that their 12-year-old was going to get pregnant, or their son was going to end up having, that their daughter was going to have 5 kids by 5 different blokes. So there was, huge anxiety that somehow that diminishing sense of agency was going to crumble, and these sort of catastrophic thoughts were taking over.
Because it ties in, I was just thinking, it ties in with a systematic review in adoption, fostering about kind of sex education needs of this population.
Yes.
And in terms of interventions for sex education and kind of preventative programs and the need for those.
Absolutely.
And I feel like that maybe links in with that there is a need, right? Maybe because of more risky behavior.
Yes.
We don't obviously know if it's there's real risk for that. Those behaviors obviously always if just the parents worry, but
Yeah. So I think that's a summary of that qualitative study. So it was a very different study to the other two I've talked about. And, we're hopefully going to have other qualitative papers published as well. And they do provide a huge amount of rich information about these families.
What do you think, just across those studies, what do you think are kind of the policy and practice implications of these findings? So how could they inform training policy now?
I mean, I think across all the studies, and even the ones I've not spoken about today, I think there's a real sense that during the period of adolescence, there's heightened issues that emerge for a lot of these families. And a lot of these adoptive parents spoke in the interview about a lack of support and how they could benefit from having more input at this stage. They had a lot of input earlier on when their children were first placed, and then nothing during adolescence. And parents really said there were so many concerns and challenges that they were facing, and there was such an amplification of issues that felt like they needed some support from. So that was definitely a learning, not just in that fears paper I've talked about, but across. And then I guess the learning in relation to the two attachment papers is really maybe sort of how social workers and therapists are needing to work with these young people in terms of disconfirming those negative models. So we know that the positive stuff is increasing, but the negative stuff is still remaining, and it's still remaining even in adolescence.
So would you say that maybe attachment interventions could just be the standard for late placed children, that they get additional support or kind of attachment type interventions?
Absolutely. It feels so important that attachment interventions become embedded, and that social workers and adoptive parents have the resources to be able to learn how to have those strategies to disconfirm those models and help build up new positive ones. And I know some of that does take place, but it's very inconsistent and patchy. And I think all the parental and therapeutic work really does need to focus on attachment and into adolescence.
And earlier on as well, isn't it? Like, it's always these. I feel like a lot of the conversations are always around, if only we had more preventative measures or interventions early on, we could prevent so many things, kind of knock-on effects further downstream, or before it escalates and before families are in crisis.
Absolutely. And actually, one of the areas I've not spoken about today, and probably because we've not really sort of looked at it in sufficient detail, is we did collect data from the adoptive parents using the adult attachment interview.
Mm-hmm.
And so in terms of placement, we've got, again, the possibility of actually doing adult attachment interviews early on with these prospective parents to get some sense of their attachment profiles and making sure that the placement is well aligned with the child in terms of their own not just their attachment representation, but their overall profile. So I think there's a lot of scope. It happens in places, but that could be more formalized potentially.
Did you find that the adoptive parent attachment had a positive or negative effect?
Yes, we're still looking at that now. So, I'm not in a position to say sort of a huge amount more. And we're also hoping over the next year to look at the adoptive parents' adult attachment interview in relation to the young adults. So we've interviewed the young adults in the third phase using the adult attachment interview. Now, not on a huge sample because of attrition. Nevertheless, we will then have the benefit of being able to sort of look across that young person's AAIs in relation to their adoptive parents.
So that's some kind of a teaser of what's to come.
A teaser, yeah, a taster, something that we would, be very interested in unpacking. And of course, the sample size in our third phase is not ideal for any strong quantitative pieces of work. But I think even as a descriptive statistical piece, hopefully we could show some useful patterns.
And if our listeners want to know more about your studies or work with you, how can they get in touch with you?
Yes, be delighted to hear more. So, I'd be more than happy for people to contact me. I can leave my details by email at the Anna Freud, where I work. Interestingly, given the fact that we've completed the third phase of the study, so we are very much in the sort of analysis and dissemination phase. We are in the planning stages of having a conference, possibly some webinars, which will report on all phases, but particularly drawing upon the third phase, the adult phase, which we're only starting to look at now. So again, we're managing this with a wonderful array of postgraduate students, and we've also benefited from retired social workers supporting us as well, because we've not managed to secure funding for that. So those are the plans, and to try and disseminate our work in a sort of a meaningful way in relation to policy and practice.
That sounds good. Well, we're going to link your contact details with the podcast so that people have all the information and can find you. We're also going to link the paper so that people can have an in-depth read about all the interesting findings. And it was very nice to have you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to have had this opportunity to talk about these papers. So thank you.
Did you know that reading one of our publications can count towards your CPD? Why not discuss one of our titles with a colleague and record this as your peer reflection? Get one of our publications today and feel prepared for the deadline. Visit corumbaf.org.uk/books for more.